you'll start Facebook because people also follow Stephanie on Facebook, which is often more accessible for many of our comrades.
Yeah.
And we tape the session as well on Facebook, the first part that you deliver, and then we come off the taping when it comes to us asking silly questions. Okay, so welcome to all of the participants on this Jack Simons Party School event. Stephanie, one of the few silver linings of the COVID-19 pandemic is that we've all got onto Zooming and suddenly discovered that it's a way of running political education and having interactions, not just political education in some top-down way, but engagements with each other, which were often very difficult. You know, as you know well, I mean, even within a township, it's very difficult to convene a meeting on a Sunday or whatever, because these things are so expensive, so difficult for people to get to and so on. So Zoom is helping us. And I think we're going to be remaining on Zoom quite a bit, I think, beyond, if there is a beyond.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, so I think many of us know of you, Stephanie, and some of us have clearly met you. But for those who perhaps don't know you, you were born in Cape Town and of socialist parents. I'm not sure what that means. Were they?
Trotskyist parents, actually.
Say that again?
Trotskyist parents, to put a finer definition.
Okay, I suspected that. That's fine. That's okay. I think we need to recover some of that tradition as well. Okay.
Yeah.
And then as a young woman, at 23, I think you were, you went into self-imposed exile, basically coming out of the left tradition. And I think it was, when was it? 63?
67.
67, yeah. So it was the grand years of apartheid, things that, you know, resistance struggle had been smashed terribly. And yeah. And but you didn't forget South Africa or Southern Africa or the liberation struggles. And you became very active in the United States in the disinvestment campaign and generally in solidarity struggles of one kind or another. And then I think you met up in the course of that work with, amongst others, Amilcar Cabral, lucky you. Amazing. And that led to you doing a trek through the liberated zones of Guinea-Bissau. Amazing story. And your first book that I'm aware of came out of that. It was called Fighting Two Colonialisms, Women in Guinea-Bissau. And then after the liberation, emancipation in Mozambique, you became particularly focused, well, amongst other things, on independent Mozambique and went back there quite often, and that resulted in your second book that I'm aware of, which is And Still They Dance, and it's about Mozambican women encountering the complexities of not just the struggle against Portuguese the struggle against Portuguese colonialism, but of the new reality in which not all of the old reality disappears, of course. And recently, you've written a book about mapping my way home, about your basically coming back to South Africa. I think first time in 1991, and then quite often in future times. So we're really looking forward to this. You're going to be focusing. I think we've asked you to look at lessons of the women's struggle in Mozambique in particular, at a time when in South Africa, not for the first time, but where we are confronting huge problems of violence in general, gender-based violence, femicide, and general challenges of, you know, a democracy, which we're very proud of. I heard you saying in some podcasts that I listened to the other day, that important gains, constitutional gains, democratic gains, and so on, but many, many challenges, not least the continued patriarchal and other forms of oppression of women in our country. So what are lessons we need and can learn from the struggle of Mozambican women? Over to you. And thanks so much. We're really pleased to have made yourself available.
Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you, Jenny, for inviting me. What I'm going to do is really take us back to those days. I'm going to talk about Guinea-Bissau and Mozambique, as Jeremy introduced me. I did, well, you know, when I think back, it's sort of over 40 years. It's difficult to think in those lengths of time. And we stood, what happened then still resonates. The world has obviously changed. The kind of hope I think we had in the 70s and into the 80s have not been realized as fully as we would like, to put it mildly. So I think what I'll do is just bring you with me into the times in the 70s when I visited Guinea-Bissau, what my impressions were, what I learned from many of the women, move on a bit to Mozambique, and then try and draw a few lessons. But I think what I love is the questions that come up and the responses that we can have in the dialogue, in the conversation that continues. So let me start. I'll give some background. I think I might overlap a little with what Jeremy's been saying. But I do want to first thank you really for being here. And as Jeremy says, one of the benefits of the COVID, if one can even use that word, is the ability to Zoom and to meet many more people. So as the names pop up here, I see that there's quite a big audience. So thank you everybody for coming. My writing and my interaction with the anti-Portuguese colonial struggle began soon after my arrival in the US when I immigrated from South Africa in the late 1960s, 67 as we noted. When I got to the US, my first desire, my first goal was to find the anti-apartheid movement. It was much more muted than it was at Britain that time, but there was a growing interest in Southern Africa. Particularly, I think it came out of the civil rights movement, the concerns that what was happening in the US led people to look at what was happening in South Africa in particular. And I got involved with a small committee, Southern Africa Committee, that produced a magazine. I edited the magazine. It was the only publication, small as it was, that actually covered what was happening in Southern Africa and the struggles at the time. New York Times, other big publications didn't think it was relevant. So we filled a small gap. And as a result of that, I was seen as a journalist. I wasn't really thinking of myself as a journalist. I was thinking of myself more as an activist. And I got invited to the liberated zones of Guinea-Bissau and arrived in April 1974. Meanwhile, just to backtrack a little to the US, the divestment movement was growing with leaps and bounds. It became the focus of the anti-apartheid work in the US. And I'd like to just read something from my memoir that Jeremy mentioned that kind of captures the part of that time, which I think says it better than if I was just going to talk about it right now. By the end of 1984, 40 US companies had withdrawn their investments from South Africa. Another 50 would do so the following year. By the beginning of 1985, Citibank had refused to make any new loans, and Chase Manhattan refused to roll over its long-term loans, creating a major financial crisis. And this, I might add, was all because of the kind of organizing that was happening on the ground. The issue was taken up by trade unions, by faith-based organizations, by university students, by high schools, by city and state councils, all calling for the divestment of their funds the divestment of any of the investments in organizations, corporations that did business with South Africa. So this was the pressure that was mounted in an extraordinary way. And it caught the imagination of people throughout the US. It became a big, big issue. Through all of this, President Reagan continued to argue for constructive engagement. He would say in any forum that provided the opportunity that divestments and sanctions would only hurt Black people in South Africa. Change could only happen through dialogue. Those youth in South Africa trying to storm South Africa's Bastille had given up dialogue a long time ago. Dialogue presupposes that two parties are willing to negotiate. The whites were certainly not. They were not ready to make significant compromises or even to acknowledge their position of privilege. The response was to increase violence and repression. Reagan worked hand in cozy glove with his friend and ally, Margaret Thatcher, who reflected both their views in a CBS interview in July 1985. There she said in her anxious voice, "I think a policy of sanctions would harm the very people in South Africa you are trying to help. I agree with the policy of trying to influence South Africa by other means. The present government is moving forward in the direction we wish them to go, faster than any other. Sanctions will harm, not help." I didn't know whether to laugh or scream. President Reagan had his comeuppance a year later in 1986, when Congress overrode his veto of the Comprehensive Anti-Apartheid Act. The CAAA banned all new US trade and investment in apartheid and barred all federal departments and agencies, including the police and military, from providing funds and assistance to South Africa. It added its weight to the divestment and sanctions bills already passed by local and state legislatures and spurred the sanction movements in Europe as well. From 1982 to 1985, the divestment campaign drove over 4 million of US capital investment out of South Africa. And all of this is because of the kind of protest that was mounted against apartheid, which caught the imagination, as I said, across America. At this time, for me, I was involved in the anti-apartheid movement. I was involved in the solidarity with the anti-Portuguese colonial movement, and very excited by the growing women's movement, the feminist movement. That was new to me when I arrived in the US. One of the benefits of living in New York was the regular visits by the leaders of the African liberation movements, who had observer status at the United Nations. When they came to address the UN, they would hold informal meetings with the solidarity committees, and this is how I met Cabral, the leader of PAIGC, African Party for the Independence of Guinea and Cape Verde. Let me read yet another excerpt. Let me just find it. It describes the occasion that I met Cabral shortly before he was assassinated in 1973. Amilcar Cabral's profound analytical prowess and vision of the revolution made him the doyen of the liberation movement leaders. With seeming ease, he could turn complex ideology and political analysis into simple words that gave us the wherewithal to argue reasonably, eloquently, and cogently the importance of supporting their struggle. My copy of Cabral's Revolution in Guinea selected text was held together with rubber bands, the spine cracked and the binding unglued, the pages yellow with use and the margins filled with my scribbling. His words slipped into our language to be retrieved when we spoke about African revolutions. Though I longed for a democratic South Africa, I heeded his caution that people were not fighting simply for ideas. They are fighting to win material benefits, to live better in peace, and to see their lives go forward, to guarantee the future of the children. It was for this that they waged an armed struggle, he said. Listening to Cabral was one of those few moments in my life when I knew I was in the presence of a great human being. He talked about the reluctance of his movement to resort to armed struggle, but that the brutality, violence, and destruction of the Portuguese regime left them with no choice. He talked about the importance of our solidarity with his revolution and the strength the people took from it. He talked about the new nation that was emerging in the liberated zones, the areas of the country that were under PAIGC control, where the schools and healthcare were being provided to the peasants for the first time. Progress, he told us, was built on a deliberate and careful process of winning over the people. A revolution without total support of the people, one that was top-down and dictatorial, could never succeed. Then he turned to a subject I was hoping for, women's participation. Women were fully engaged, he said. They had needed little encouragement. It was they who insisted on an equal role with men in the movement. Here was a man articulating what we were grappling with, but in a revolution in a tiny African country. I wanted to know more. How was it possible to change the patriarchy of African society? Did the fight against colonialism mean that it would be easier to establish a new society that was able to counter deep-seated cultural attitudes? It was hard enough to dislodge patriarchy in the United States. Could this small African country achieve what we could only dream of? My commitment to both the revolutions in the Portuguese colonies and my involvement in the women's movement came together in a burning desire to find out more. And so when I was invited to visit the liberated zones of Guinea-Bissau, I asked that I meet with women to talk with them about the impact of the revolution in Guinea-Bissau and on their lives. I hope to be able to add to the writings about women and other revolutions I was learning about. PIGC declared the armed struggle in 1963. It ended in 1974 when Portugal recognized the independent Republic of Guinea-Bissau. For the first time in the history of sub-Saharan Africa, a guerrilla movement had forced a colonial power to withdraw. Cabral provided not only exceptional leadership, but a theoretical formulation firmly rooted in the African experience. He trained as an agronomist in Portugal, where he became engaged in anti-colonial clandestine discussions with the likes of Agostinho Neto and Marcelino dos Santos. In 1952, he returned to Guinea-Bissau to conduct an agricultural census, which meant he visited villages throughout the small country and spoke with the peasants one-to-one. This was his real education, and out of this came his deep understanding of the daily oppression under which people of Guinea-Bissau suffered. It was the basis for his analysis and for the founding of PIGC in 1946 and the launching of the armed struggle 7 years later. I spent 8 weeks with PIGC, visiting 2 fronts and in Conakry, where they had their headquarters. I arrived in April 1994. My guide was Theodora Gomes, a regional political commissar who had studied in the Soviet Union. We walked for days and miles from her base to nearby villages, to health centers, to other sites where I could interview women. Our feet were our only form of transport. Then, April 25th, 1974. The course of the war changed dramatically. Again, I would like to capture the moment through a passage from my memoir. One of Theodora's treasured possessions, along with her revolver and the portable manual typewriter that she worked on at her base, was a small, black, scratched-up shortwave radio. It accompanied her everywhere. Each evening, a group of cadres would cluster around to listen to the news from Lisbon. The evening of April 25th, 1974 was no exception. Theodora turned on her radio and with her intense frown, fiddled with the turner to get more than static and hisses and occasional words. Then suddenly, the clear voice of the Portuguese announcer cut through the evening air. After a few minutes, I saw a look of disbelief on the faces of those around the radio. They began shouting to each other to come and listen. I watched as they stood in stunned silence, listening intently to the voice emanating from the tiny radio, their faces flushed and incredulous. The announcer was talking in rapid-fire Portuguese. I heard the words Marcelo Caetano, Antonio Spinola, but I couldn't understand the rest. Only when I pulled at my interpreter's arm was I able to pry him loose just enough for him to tell me what he had heard. "There's been a coup in Portugal," he said, briefly glancing my way before turning back to the radio. What on earth was happening? A coup? By whom? Good guys? Bad guys? That very day, we'd been in trenches while planes dropped bombs on us. Was the coup staged by people in the military, even further to the right than the Prime Minister, Caetano? I could only wait. Then, when the newscast ended, everyone talked at once. Excitement competed with disbelief, and loud voices argued each other down. My interpreter explained that the young army officers had overthrown the government, that Caetano had fled the president's residence and was seeking refuge. Those around me weren't dancing. They weren't convinced that Spinola, an exemplary officer of the fascist regime, who at one time was Governor General of Guinea-Bissau, bent on crushing the resistance, could represent anything but a right-wing coup. And now he was the interim leader. At the very least, it was more of the same. It was obviously a great turning point for Africa, not only for Guinea-Bissau. Guinea-Bissau gained independence not many months later, in September 1974. Mozambique had to wait longer, to 1975. In fact, in Mozambique, it was very clear to Frelimo that they had to continue the struggle, the armed struggle, to really push the Portuguese. They had ended fascism, but had they ended colonialism? They were worried that that was not going to happen. In the end, Mozambique too became independent in, I think it was July 1975. So these struggles, the will of the people and the struggles that had gone along in a very, very brutal and difficult manner in terms of the response by the Portuguese army, had brought about a change that far sooner than anybody could have hoped for. As I traveled through Guinea-Bissau, I interviewed many women and began to gain a picture of the war of liberation on their lives. Many women, particularly Theodora, who was with me, would talk about how PIGC had taken up the importance of women's participation in the struggle from the beginning. She and others would quote Cabral's words. In Guinea-Bissau, we say we are fighting two colonialisms, one of the Portuguese and the other of men. I'll return to this comment later on, or the statement. In as early as 1966, a journalist traveling with Cabral in the zones liberated by PAJC recorded an address by Cabral to a mass meeting of peasants. Comrades, he said, we are going to place women in high-ranking posts, and we want them at every level, from the village committees up to the party leadership. What for? To administer our schools, our clinics, to take an equal share in production, and to go into combat against the Portuguese when necessary. The women and girls will go into villages as nurses or teachers, or they will work in production or in the village militias. We want the women of our country to have guns in their hands. Comrades, young girls are going to be coming into the village from our bases, but no one should think that these girls are up for sale as brides. They will get married if they wish, but there will be no forced marriages. Anyone who does this is worse than the Portuguese. These young girls are going to work in the villages, go to school, be in the militia and the party, and the party will exercise complete control. The women must hold their heads high and know that our party is also their party. Our party repeats to every one of you that the road we have taken I liken to the Farim River. It never turns to its source, but flows towards the sea. Likewise, the PIGC will reach its goal, which is the true independence of our people. This was one of the few recorded examples of how Cabral spoke to the people and the way in which PIGC directives were translated into the process of political mobilization. One such directive around the early years of the armed struggle read, defend the rights of women, respect and make others respect them, but persuade the women of our country that their liberation must be their own achievement on the basis of their work, dedication to the party, self-respect, personality, and decisiveness towards everything that can act against their dignity. To entrench this, certain regulations were established. At least 2 out of 5 members of any committee at the local and regional level would have to be women. This included village committees, regional councils, and justice tribunals. How this actually played out, I could not really judge. Were women tokens? Were the wives of women who wielded local power elected? How many women fought for these rights and were accepted? I suspect there was a mix. But the quota system was a start of raising consciousness about the conditions that women lived under, beginning the process of thinking about what equality and freedom could mean. I'd like to bring you a few of the voices of the women who best tell their story. One woman I interviewed at Theodora's base was early one morning. She had walked for perhaps 2 hours to get to me. Her name was Bwetna Ndubi. She was a Balanta. And what she wrote, I found very, very compelling. Well, what she said, I should say, I found really compelling. This was a woman who was one of the 99% of people in Guinea-Bissau who were illiterate. Bwetna, who acted as a liaison between the people in the villages and her region and the regional representatives of the People's National Assembly, spoke passionately about the need for the revolution, about the importance of the war in mobilizing people for a new life, and about the need to liberate women, and about Cabral. Her husband had been chosen by her uncles as her father was no longer alive. Her mother had said no had no say in the decision, neither had Bwetna. I did not understand anything that they give, I take, she added, but it was not necessary, as now he understands something about the need for equality between women and men, she said, referring to her husband. Bwetna first heard about the need to fight for women's rights at the time of mobilization. It had meant a lot to her. She understood from her own experience that equality was both necessary and possible. Today, I work together with men, having more responsibility than many men. This is not only true for me. I understand that I have to fight together with other women against the domination of women by men, but we have to fight twice. Once to convince women, and a second time to convince men that women have to have the same rights as men. Before life was very difficult for women. The party has brought new ways and a new life for women, but we must continue to defend our lives, our rights ourselves. Another was a Muslim woman, Kumba Kalibali. And what she said to me: when the first comrade came here to mobilize us, we were very afraid. We did not know him, so we did not trust him. We thought he was dangerous and that he would take our things and not pay for them. But he talked about all the bad things that the Portuguese were doing, which we understood very well. He said that the party believes that everybody is equal and that we are all one people. Later, the party organized a committee in the village to take care of matters that related to the party and to the village. It was elected by the people in our village, and we elected 2 women as well. Before, this would not have been possible. We could not have even imagined that things like this could happen. But now, life is very different. Now I see more light. Now I know that everybody is my brother and sister. Now we don't talk about color or ethnic group the way we did before. We know that everybody is from Guinea-Bissau. I spent probably, I think it was about 3 weeks in the company of Theodora as we as I continued to gather information, as we saw the bombing recede and then stop. And so there was a very strong sense of hope that was beginning to emerge. It was beginning to be clear that no, this was not a right-wing coup. And it was soon evidence from the radio and the way in which people were speaking about Camarada Gil Fernandez, for instance, Camarada the names of other very prominent leaders in the Guinea-Bissau and the PIGC, that it became very clear that things were changing and that independence was imminent. Towards the end of my visit, I interviewed Theodora. She had been very resistant to me interviewing her, and I think we got into quite a struggle in order to sit her down. And I realized later, when I think about it, that I must have been a pretty difficult journalist, kept on insisting on wanting to interview people, when I think at that time, she probably just wanted to get back to headquarters and begin to work on the new Guinea-Bissau. What she said to me, I found particularly telling, because it came out of her own experience, which was shaped by her understanding of PIGC and the principles of the revolution that she was part of. By a liberated woman, I mean a woman who has had a clear consciousness about her responsibility in the society and who is economically independent. By a liberated woman, I mean one who is able to do all the jobs in society without being discriminated against, a woman who can go to school to learn, who can become a leader. The liberation of women is one aspect of our revolution. It is one element of our struggle, because without equality for all people, without equal opportunity to go to school, to get medical care, without equality in work, it is not possible for a woman to be free. Without a revolution in the system of education, so that both girls and boys are educated, they have the same responsibility, there will be no liberated women in our society. You cannot isolate the liberation of women in circumstances such as ours, because there's one goal for society, which is to transform it step by step. Another element I found critical or interesting was the emphasis on the role of women's work within the home, what came later to be known as the unpaid care economy. Theodora voiced a view of the future that I think might have been influenced by her studies in the Soviet Union, saying when women had to work at home, cooking, take care of the children, and preparing everything for the men when they are working on the land, as well as working themselves. They could do nothing but sleep at night, and the next day work in the village and in the fields, sleep, work at home and in the fields. They did not have the time or opportunity to learn, to study, to do anything else. The solution, she said, was childcare, agricultural technology, and cooperatives to free women and men from the hard, endless work they had been doing. All the needs of the peasants will be met within the community, she continued. Then peasant women can be free. She and PIGC were touching on something that has only more recently been recognized as critical to gender equality, namely that the unpaid care economy limits women's participation in the labor force, leading to lower wages and discriminatory job opportunities. This is a global reality. So I was interested that it was at least acknowledged this 40 years, more than 40 years ago in those circumstances. I'll return a bit to this later. What is the takeaway from Guinea-Bissau in terms of women? The armed struggle, the revolution in Guinea-Bissau was clear that the transformation of their country was dependent on what they would have referred to as the emancipation of women. When I returned to Guinea-Bissau after independence, soon after independence, in fact, and then again in the 1980s, it was clear that much had been lost. I met women leaders of PIGC who had interviewed in the liberated zones and who had espoused PIGC policies with passion. Now occupying senior positions in government, they were promoting courses to train hairdressers so that women could look attractive to men, or organizing embroidery lessons through convent nuns. But this wasn't the only facet of what was happening. At the same time, the women's organization was strengthened in the years that immediately followed, and gains were made in terms of encouragement to take part in the national reconstruction. By 1982, the women's organization was restructured with a mandate to include, and I quote, the construction of a democratic society in which all citizens have the same rights and duties without discrimination on the basis of color, sex, religion, or social origin, a society where it is guaranteed They guaranteed the exercise of fundamental freedoms and rights. This was 8 years after independence. And then, soon after, the efforts of the national reconstruction fell apart, replaced by years of conflict, coups, and the establishment of what is now being referred to as a narco-state. Despite this, I've learned that many women's NGOs are functioning well in Guinea-Bissau, far more effectively than other NGOs as they continue to push for gender equality. In the mid-1970s, the issue of gender equality had been increasingly adopted globally. An international women's movement had gained strength. It is a question whether a continuing quest for equality in Guinea-Bissau is the result of the ground laid by the revolution or the international focus and activism around gender equality. I want to believe it was both, or it is both. After my book was published in 1979, I was invited to contribute to a book on national reconstruction in Mozambique, to write about the role of women in post-independent Mozambique. This chapter developed into the book, as Jeremy mentioned, where I was able to explore the issue at more than the confines of an article. As a result, I visited Mozambique regularly during the following 7 years. I was drawn to this work by a statement of Samora Machel that was widely known and repeated within Mozambique and amongst feminists looking to the newly independent countries in Africa for inspiration and guidance. The liberation of women is a fundamental necessity for the revolution, a guarantee for its continuity and a precondition for victory. Frelimo had been established by Eduardo Malan in 1962. The armed struggle was declared 2 years later in 1964, around the same time as PIGC and MPLA in Angola. These were not coincidental. The leaders of the movements have been in constant contact and discussing strategy and ideology. While Guinea-Bissau had managed to liberate 2/3 of the countryside, Frelimo's task, given the size of the country, was much more challenging. When the coup overthrew the Portuguese fascist regime, it did not end colonialism, and Frelimo stepped up the fight against the Portuguese colonial forces. It wasn't long before it too was able to establish the independent nation of Mozambique in 1975. Samora Machel, who became president of Frelimo when Eduardo Malan was assassinated in 1969, was the first president. As you know, he was killed when his plane came down on South African territory in 1986 under mysterious circumstances. There's still a debate about whether it was a crash or an assassination. Mozambique's independence began with the commitment to supporting the liberation struggles in South Africa, most notably its neighbors. This resulted in conflict with the then Rhodesia for its support of the Zimbabwean struggle for independence, and in the growing concern by South Africa for the influence of Mozambique's example might have on the anti-apartheid struggle inside and outside the country, and the material support for the ANC. For the first 5 years of independence, its support of the Zimbabwean struggle resulted in considerable economic hardship, with much of its meager resources going towards the military to secure its borders. With Zimbabwean independence in 1980 came a sigh of relief. Work could now be aimed more fully at national reconstruction. They had 3 years. By 1983, South Africa had launched its support of Renamo, and a horrific conflict against Frelimo ensued. A peace accord was finally signed in 1992, but it did not take long for tensions to rise. And today, Mozambique is once more contending with conflict and an insurgency in a country battered by previous conflict, growing corruption, and the loss of control of areas of the north. But then in 1980, for me, the process of gathering material for writing about women took me all over Mozambique, visiting communal villages, state farms, factories, cooperatives. Frelimo had decreed the end to customs they saw as counter to the values of the new Mozambique, such as initiation rites, polygamy, lobolo. It was clear from my visits over days to the communal villages that these decrees had morphed into different practices. For example, I was assured that lobolo, which was deemed to be no more than the buying of wife, was no longer practiced. However, it soon became evident that the gifts that were given to the bride-to-be's family to show appreciation for the rearing of a wonderful daughter were pretty similar to lobolo. The value of these appreciative gifts was the same as the value of lobolo and were negotiated on the quiet. What was missing in these decrees was an understanding of what role they played in society and whether such deep-seated cultural practices could simply be decreed without education and adjustment. For instance, is lobolo simply a purchase of a woman because she has no value? Or is it a compensation for the important reproductive and productive role that she plays in her family? Is polygamy only cultural, a way of showing that women have no value, or is it also economic? Given the heavy load of work, a man and his family gains from more workers in the fields and taking care of the household and the children, work that is eased when shared. A focus on such critical issues came to a head with the preparations for the 1984 conference of the Organization of Women, the OMM. It was a vibrant time. The idea was to collect data that was channeled to headquarters, not only regarding the nature of the customs, such as initiation rites, polygamy, etc., but regarding women's and men's attitudes to these customs and how they might be changed or replaced. Never before had such an energetic debate taken place countrywide. The preparations took the form of a campaign where thousands of meetings were held throughout every district of every province to discuss the topics on the agenda. There were public meetings and meetings held in cooperatives, state farms, factories, villages, and the byrows of the towns and cities. It caught fire. People were debating energetically in their workplaces, at home, at bus stops, in stores, anywhere where small and larger groups congregated. This continued for months prior to the date of the conference. Women felt empowered. They spoke out, they argued, they criticized men's attitudes. Delegates were chosen from the provinces and headed to Maputo from all over the country, many traveling on planes for the first time in their lives. A lively debate was anticipated, with the culmination of an official report reflecting the debate and divided democracy. The conference was to be opened and closed by President Michel. But once he arrived, he decided to stay. At first, it was regarded by OMM as an honor. But then he began to intervene with his own interpretations of the discussions. The debate was muted. Women lost their voice. He interviewed to counter arguments that he felt were not in line with Frelimo's policies. His comments were drawn out and left little time for the delegates from the conferences to have their say and therefore input in the final document. Observers found many of his comments misogynistic and moralistic. One issue of the question of unmarried mothers was on the agenda with a desire to be supported and to address their particular concerns. Michel interjected. To be an unmarried woman is a disgrace, he pronounced. OMM disagreed, and it was the one conclusion in the report where they stood their ground, saying that unmarried mothers should be helped rather than castigated. But the conference itself was derailed. OMM was unable to assert itself as an independent organization from the party or to assist its role as an organization dedicated to gender equality in the future. And this was seen as a turning point. Maura Michel's statements had been so strong early on. And yet with the reality of what was happening in his country, by 1984, the war was really beginning to show up in a very devastating way. I think his worries just took over. And his perceptions and commitment to the liberation of women became rather muted. As in Guinea-Bissau, I traveled through Mozambique, this time for many months over a number of years, and interviewed women who shared the hopes for a better future for their country. There were many activists on the local and national level who were committed to change and transformation and were totally inspiring. One of the most impressive women was Lena Magaya. Lena was one of the members of the National Assembly. Close to 50% of the women were on the National Assembly, an achievement in itself and indicative of some of the changes that were happening in Mozambique in terms of women. She herself was a journalist and had written about the horrors of the conflict, relating stories of killings and tortures that were a mark of the brutal conflict. She spoke a number of Mozambican languages and often traveled with me as my interpreter. Let me read one of the stories about her from my memoir. Lena was invaluable to me. She provided economic, political, and social context. Lena did not simply translate language. She translated culture. Soon after we started working together, we visited a small women's agricultural cooperative. We were shown around by the co-op president. We saw poorly cultivated fields dependent on rains that had not come. We saw cages of undernourished rabbits, some showing signs of mage. A few perky ducklings wagging their tails as they waddled about, some skinny chickens scratching on the stony ground. After the tour, the 20 co-op members gathered around us in a clearing. They sat in a semicircle on the ground, straight-legged and straight-backed. At the edge of the group sat 2 local officials, also on stools, a man from the District Frelimo office and a woman from the local OMM. The man held a notebook and a pen on his lap. The women were quick to respond to Lena's jokey manner with their own banter, providing an energy that was absent from the co-op itself. They took turns to tell us about their lives under colonialism and how much better they fared after independence. They expressed pride in their co-op, just 2 years old, where they each put in 3 days a week of work and then cultivated their own mashambas on the remaining 4 days. They seemed undaunted by the poor harvests, which provided very little for them to divide up amongst themselves, let alone to sell. As I listened, one of the questions kept coming into my head. What motivated these women to work with such commitment without tangible benefit? Lena turned to me, ready to translate my questions. I explained that I was stumped by this particular one, finding it hard to phrase in a way that would elicit more than pat answers. She grasped my problem instantly. Tell me, she said, looking around the circle and taking in each woman in turn. If a man comes here tomorrow and says to you, I will buy your cooperative and pay a regular salary each week to continue working here, will you sell? There was a murmur of no's and nevers accompanied by a vigorous shaking of head. This is our cooperative, they responded. Every day we see progress, even if it's slow. You have just seen our new little ducklings, and they will grow and bring us an income. The united front was broken by one young co-op member. I would definitely sell, she said. Why? Lena asked. The woman stood up and looked directly at Lena, speaking with a strong voice. You are pregnant, she said, which Lena was. You believe that the baby inside you will grow up healthy and look after you in your old age, just as we hope our ducklings will. You don't know, though, do you? As for me, I must feed my children. I must feed them now. The reaction from the 2 officials was immediate. The Frelimo cadre, pencil poised, asked officiously, what is your name? The woman's confidence crumpled. There was silence. All the women stared down into their laps, visibly perturbed. Lena was up in a flash. Clapping her hands and swinging her large, supple body, she began to dance as she stretched out her hands and pulled one woman after another to her feet to lead them in a rousing Frelimo dance and song. When the song ended, the women were laughing. The tension was released, and the official put his notebook away. Towards the end of our visit, I randomly asked some of the women to tell me their names and offer details about their background. I avoided the dissenter, not wanting to embarrass her. Nina nudged me. Ask her, she said. It's important that she and others understand that they can give their names without repercussions. I did. This time, no notebook was whipped out. And when the women danced and smiled their goodbyes, we were joined by the 2 officials, broadly smiling. Quintessential Lena. But by the mid-1980s, Mozambique's national reconstruction was derailed by the growing conflict, a conflict in which the apartheid regime played a heavy hand and which resulted in an estimated 1 million deaths and 2 million displaced. Women's emancipation was a clear and stated goal of both the revolutions in Guinea and Mozambique. Many advances were made, but the word emancipation implies, to me at least, the granting of freedom. Emancipation does not tell the story of demand for equality. It does not refer to gender relations that are relations of power. The transformation of power relations is a process that takes time and needs clarity of purpose. And it takes the involvement of men. Even though Cabral spoke about the colonialism of men, it is not quite accurate. And now I was very excited by that catchy phrase more than 40 years ago. But now I'm a little more critical of it, or I think it was a very important phrase for the time because it was something that people could rally around. But gender relations are based on attitudes and behavior that are socially determined, and as such, catch both men and women in their way. The quest, the fight, the struggle for gender equality cannot be done in a vacuum. Over more than recent decades, it is understood that gender equality is about women's rights and therefore about justice and human rights. It is a fight that all society needs to be engaged in. Its advances can be measured in different ways. One is the understanding of the nature of gender-based violence and the need for women to challenge it and for men to do the work of personal transformation, while laws are put in place and mechanisms adopted that will ensure that women are protected. National economies need to recognize that women's unpaid labor contributes silently to the system of national accounts. If that work was not done, people would not eat, children would not be cared for. An enormous amount of unpaid time is spent cooking, cleaning, caring for children, taking care of the sick and the elderly, and often missing work within the labor force to do so. It is invariably the women in the house who bear the burden of this without. This is a limited resource. It has to be divided between labor and leisure, reproductive and reproductive activities, paid and unpaid labor. The unpaid care economy, gender-based violence, and the general lack of women's rights that are embedded in the society across the world are being increasingly challenged. Gender cuts through race and class, in my belief, which is why it encompasses some struggle for an equitable society and at all levels, and struggle is the key. It is work that has to be done by all of us, both men and women. When we look back at how the revolutions in Portuguese colonies incorporated the essential requirement of the liberation of women, as it was then referred to, we see struggles ahead of their times. The revolutions might have failed their people in the decades following independence, but it is worth looking at what was behind the policies, what drove the transformational processes, how new societies in which women were equal to men were perceived, and gender justice was seen as their goal for a just world. We can learn from the women and the men who fought so hard for freedom while not pushing women aside till after victory, believing that the liberation of women was a guarantee for victory. Thank you. I now look forward to a rich discussion.
Thank you very, very much, Stephanie. If you look at the messages, you'll see that Nick Mampele right early on said, wow. And Zamani said, wow, indeed. And I think we've all greatly enjoyed the style of telling, which is you've traversed two major revolutions, but touched on a broader struggle for freedom through stories, which I think is a wonderful way of capturing our imagination and getting us to understand the detail. So we're going to invite